What is everything that goes into making a garment? And can we create a piece of clothing entirely locally? I'm going to find out. Similar to the 100-mile diet or farm-to-table movement, I've challenged myself to apply this concept to clothing and see if we can create a garment from start to finish in Edmonton and Alberta. My name is Erin, and this is the ultimate slow fashion journey. We're going to explore the entire process from farm to closet. In the previous episode, we learned how wool is cleaned and spun into yarn, and now we're going to dye some of the yarn with plants. The majority of the coat will be white. I'll be using mostly the natural wool color, but I wanted to add some visual interest and also use some local dye sources and plants. So my design includes these stripes across the bottom. I've been playing around with natural dyes as a hobby for years, using some traditional dyes, but mostly kitchen scraps because they're fun to experiment with, they're of course easily available, and a great way to use a kitchen waste. But for this project, I started researching what local dye plants grow here and plants that I could maybe grow myself. I tried growing some red amaranth, but my tests unfortunately weren't successful. And while there are some interesting native dye plants, it also didn't sit quite right for me to go and forage and pick native plants, which are so important for our local biodiversity. But then I discovered Kalea and her weed dyeing project.
My name is Kalea Veremenko-Beckman. I'm a natural dyer, spinner, knitter, weaver, textile maker. I was already heavily into the craft world in knitting and spinning, and was using a lot of natural fibers and was thinking a lot about synthetic fibers in textiles versus natural fibers, microplastics. So the natural dyes seemed to complement the natural fibers that I was working with. I got to meet Megan Sams, who's an incredible weaver from Newfoundland, and a natural dyer, and she taught a weekend workshop thing in Slave Lake on natural dyeing with invasive weeds. And that is what really lit my fire about natural dyeing. That like kitchen scraps were fun, and the traditional natural dyes that are imported were fun colors and interesting historically, but using a locally sourced material, specifically an invasive weed that is going to benefit the local ecosystem to be removed anyway, was what really got me excited. Tansy, it was one of the ones that we used that weekend, and it's a really potent dye. You don't need a whole lot, and it's fairly easy to harvest. And it also is a great dye with really good light fastness that has been historically used in Europe. So that's one of my favorite weed dyes. Sometimes when you're experimenting with local plants and there's no like research or historical like precedent in using them as dye, it's hard to tell what their long-term light fastness will be. But tansy is one that we know. During the pandemic in 2020, during the spring, when I was stuck at home and just like dyeing yarn and knitting, I did a project in the Black Mud Creek Ravine. I lived right off of the Black Mud Creek Ravine then, and I challenged myself to try at least one plant from the ravine as a dye source throughout the spring and summer. Some of the really successful ones were tansy, thistle, horsetail, the dogwood bark. This is a little like art piece that I made with a bunch of those. When we're using the like locally gathered stuff, most of what we're finding is yellow and then green with an iron mordant. Yellows and greens are very abundant in nature. Browns also. Walnut is a really good source of brown. You kind of have to experiment. There is some magic to it. Like the more you work with them and the more research you do, you can kind of have an idea of what you're going to get, but still there are surprises all the time.
For this coat, I decided to go with tansy as my main yellow stripe. Tansy is a noxious weed here in Alberta. It has these little yellow flowers and can produce a lovely bright yellow dye. And then for my second dye, I'm using yellow onion skins, which is a kitchen scrap dye I've used before, and I know I can get some really beautiful golden orange colors, which I think will work really nicely with the tansy yellow. I did do some experiments in the summer with red amaranth that I grew in my garden and was really hoping to get a nice pink dye from, but unfortunately many of my plants were eaten by bugs or critters, and the dye also just didn't work out for me very well. The pink mostly washed out and I was left with like a light beige. So for this project, I'm going with dyes I feel a lot more confident working with.
So to cover all of the steps of natural dyeing, we start with preparing the yarn. There's a first step called scouring, where you put the wool in a scouring bath, which is simmering hot water with soap to remove all of the traces of lanolin, which is the natural oil from the sheep, and any spinning oils that are still in the yarn from the spinning process. Any of those oils would impede the dye from attaching properly to the yarn or consistently. So we do a scouring bath first to fully clean the yarn. With most natural dyes, you need to put the fiber through like a pre-dyeing process, which we call mordanting. And that's where you usually use like a mineral salt, usually alum or iron, and then that helps the plant dyes adhere to the fiber. Alum is most commonly used as a pre-mordant. A lot of times when you're using iron with wool, you just use it at the end to shift the color. Alum, it creates very clear colors, and iron has natural dyers call it a saddening effect. So it turns like yellows to greens and pinks to purples and kind of can give like a gray hue to things. After the mordanting, then we can start using the colors. So then you would gather your plant material and create a dye vat. The way that I like to do it when I'm using a lot of fresh plant material is to harvest the plants, cut them up into smaller pieces depending on what plant you're working with. That process is called garbling, which I think is a really hilarious word. Put it into a vat of water, simmer it for about an hour to get all of the color to release. About an hour is where I start when I'm experimenting with something new. But if you're using a tannin-rich dye plant like onion skins or avocado skins, tannin takes a bit longer to release from the material, so I often simmer those a little bit longer. But if you're using fresh plant material like I like to do, you would put it in, remove all of the dye from the plants, and then take the plants out. So then the wool goes in. Once you've taken the plant material out, if you're doing that, then you would take your prepared wool and put it in. When you're working with wool, you're always making sure that you're not going to felt it when it goes in and out of the vat. Because you're working with hot water, felting is something that we think about a lot. Felting is when the fibers like kind of mat and adhere to each other. So this is like the classic case if you put your wool sweater in the washing machine and the dryer and it comes out all stiff and tiny because the fibers have all contracted together. So the way that I like to describe this to people is like, think of a shampoo or conditioner commercial where they have the like blown up image of the hair follicle. Wool is a lot like our hair. It's made of the same stuff, keratin. You have a shaft of fiber that has the scales all pointing in one direction in the same way that our hair does. So when you run into felting is when those scales kind of get stuck to each other. The way that wool felts is you need some combination of heat, moisture, and friction. Usually if you only have one of those things, you can get away with it. So you can put wool in to hot water if it's dry going in, but if it's wet going in, then you need it to be the same temperature. And you don't want to stir it because you don't want that friction agitation. So we gently put the wool into the dye vat. Maybe like give it a very gentle stir to make sure that the wool is distributed in the vat evenly so that you get good take up of the color and all of the fibers kind of have their own space in the vat. And then you let it simmer, usually for about an hour is what I do. Some people will let it simmer for an hour and turn the heat off and then just let it steep and cool in the pot. You can like leave it overnight for it to really like soak up as much as possible. Then we rinse it. It requires a lot of rinsing. Yeah, at each one of those steps, after scouring and then after mordanting and then after dyeing, you're rinsing to get all of the residue off. So it can use a lot of water.
Once dried, this is my tansy and onion skin dyed yarn. They're honestly brighter than I expected, which is wonderful. The colors are really vibrant. So these two skeins are now ready to be woven. But when I talk to people about natural dyes and plant dyes, usually the first concern is the color won't last.
Light fastness is one of the reasons people shy away from natural dyes. Not all natural dyes have the same kind of staying power as our modern synthetic dyes, although it's a little bit of a myth because we don't always expect synthetic dyes to last forever either. Like a synthetically dyed garment, the more you wear it and wash it, will fade over time. Your blacks will not look super black forever. And even things like that aren't textiles, like think of books where the covers have been exposed to sunlight on the spine and you take the book out of the bookcase and the spine is faded and the cover is still sharp. Like we understand that dyes fade. Faded jeans make the jeans better. As they fade and you get the lines, we understand that that's a part of the culture of denim. I would love to take that culture and expand it to all of our clothes. It's okay if things fade and change over time.
Yeah.
Like you don't expect perfection from your synthetic dyes. Why are we expecting perfection from our natural dyes? But then there's also, in the same way that there's this huge variety of characteristics in sheep breeds, there's also a huge variety in light fastness and wash fastness. There are like really historically important natural dyes like indigo, madder, weld. These are things that were grown en masse and shipped around globally because they were very intense colors and had really good light fastness. But when we're looking at locally grown things or stuff like food waste, we don't always know what we're going to get. There are some locally available plants like tansy, which is excellent light fastness, but especially the tannin-rich dyes from food waste, like avocado skins and onion skins, are kind of not the greatest. I think that they're perfectly good for everyday use, but for something like, I don't know, creating an heirloom quilt or a tapestry wall hanging that you're expecting to like pass on to your children and like really hold the color for decades, onion skins probably aren't going to do it. There are two things that we're looking at. There's wash fastness and light fastness. And with a lot of natural dyes, if you're mordanting properly, you can get really good wash fastness. Light fastness is the culprit. But with extended exposure to sunlight, the colors will fade. even in something like this, all of these colors that I chose for this sweater are good light fastness. It's marigold, tansy, and madder. But I have done color work like this where just like one of the colors is something that will fade over time or like go gray. And I think that that's interesting that like most of the pattern will hold all of the colors, but just like one little line kind of just shifts over time and it doesn't destroy the whole thing. But I actually think that this is a pro of natural dyes. Yeah, that like the instability is something that you kind of have to get used to, but I think it's really beautiful to see the passage of time in your textiles. I think the fact that they're not just exactly the same forever is actually really beautiful and is a reminder that nothing stays the same. Yeah. That we're all aging, we're all evolving. Why can't our textiles evolve with us?
I also really like the fact that the dyes can shift and change with time. How special is that? My onion skin stripe will likely change, and I'm excited to see that. I know this garment is a piece that will evolve with time. It's mostly white, so stains are probably going to happen, and it's outerwear and likely won't be this exact lovely white forever. But because it's 100% wool, if it gets stained or I'm not enjoying the colors as much anymore, I can also over dye the whole coat and continue to wear it in a new color. I just love that you can use dyes to refresh a garment or breathe new life into it. So if we compare natural dyes to our modern synthetic dyes, it is easy to see why synthetic dyes are so common. They're cheap, they're fast to use, they're consistent, and you can get pretty much any color you want. But there's also something special about natural dyes that I think we've lost. The process can be really beautiful and almost magical. You never quite know how it's going to turn out, and it's exciting to see the final result and then getting to wear it, knowing what went into that color. Natural dyes are also unique to where they come from. Someone in another part of the country can dye with the same plant and have the color come out differently based on the season, the soil, the water used. With synthetic dyes, everything is exactly the same, but with natural dyes, each color is special.
The heart of what I love about natural dyes, which is the place-specific colors that you get. Back when I was studying sustainable development and doing a lot of environmental activism, I was thinking a lot about like how do we convince people to make environmentally responsible choices? How do we convince people to change the way that they live their lives in order to heal the planet and our relationship with it? And something that I kept coming back to was developing a deep personal relationship with the land that you live on. And that has kind of guided my work for a long time. And I think about that in the natural fibers that I use when I'm sourcing from local farms, and also when I'm using locally sourced natural dye plants, whether they're weeds or things that I've grown in my garden. That they're things that come from this specific place that I live in, and that turning that land into art and wearing it on my body is a really beautiful, embodied way of being connected to the land.